Listen carefully, because this story I'm about to tell you, it will change the way you see faith, medicine, and the mysteries that science simply cannot explain. It's not a story about miracles. Not exactly. It's a story about a woman who prayed for 8 months, for a man the doctors had already given up on. It's a story about a millionaire who hated prayers, because God didn't save the one person he loved most. And it's a story about what happens is when hope collides with the inexplicable. Grace Henderson, who everyone called Gracie, was 46 years old when her world crumbled for the second time. The first time was when she lost her mother, a pain that never truly faded. The second time was when the doctors said her Uncle Arthur had stage 4, pancreatic cancer, terminal, 3 to 6 months to live. Gracie worked as a housekeeper at the Vickers family estate. She had worked there for 7 years. She was a petite woman, with calloused hands and eyes that held more secrets than her face revealed. Every day. She arrived at 6 in the morning. She cleaned meticulously. She cooked with love. She ironed with precision. And when no one was watching, she knelt in the small servants' quarters and prayed with her prayer beads. 50 Hail Marys, 5 Our Fathers, the 5 mysteries. She'd done this since she was 12, when her mother taught her that faith wasn't about asking for things, but about finding the strength to accept what comes. But now at 46, Gracie was asking. She was begging, because Arthur wasn't just her uncle. He was the only family she had left in the world. Arthur Henderson was 64 years old. He had smoked for 40 years, a pack a day, sometimes 2. When the stress of work overwhelmed him, he was a cab driver his entire life. He drove the streets of Dallas for 3 decades, knowing every corner, every shortcut, every story that passengers told him on those late-night rides. When his wife died 2 years ago, Arthur stopped driving. He stopped eating well. He stopped going to the doctor. And when he finally went, because the pain in his abdomen wouldn't let him sleep, the doctors found what he had ignored for months, a tumor the size of an orange on his pancreas, metastasis in the liver, widespread, stage 4. It was everywhere. Dr. Carol Reynolds, an oncologist of 52 years, with over 2 decades of experience, delivered the news with the same expression she had used hundreds of times: professional, compassionate, but honest, brutally so. Pancreatic cancer is one of the most aggressive. The 5-year survival rate is only about 10%. In stage 4, most patients don't make it past 6 months. Arthur listened to everything, with the same calm with which he had faced every pothole on the streets of Dallas. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just asked how long he had. When Dr. Reynolds said 3 to 6 months, Arthur nodded, got up, and walked towards the door. Before leaving, he turned around and said something that the doctor would never forget. "They've been waiting for me up there for too long," Gracie found out. That same night, Arthur called her on the phone, with that raspy voice that cigarettes had given him over 40 years, and told her the truth, bluntly. "Gracie, honey, I have cancer. I don't have much time left." Gracie couldn't speak. For several minutes, she just breathed, holding back the tears, and listened as Arthur explained that he didn't want aggressive treatment, that he was tired, that he preferred to go in peace. But Gracie was not willing to let him go, not without a fight, not without prayer. That night, after hanging up the phone, Gracie did something she hadn't done since her mother's death. She took out the wooden prayer beads that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a set of beads that was over 50 years old, a family heirloom. But the beads were worn, polished by the hands of 3 generations of women who had prayed with the same fervor, the same faith, the same hope. She held them in her fingers and prayed. She didn't ask for a miracle. She just asked for time. Time to say goodbye. Time to tell Arthur everything she had never told him. Time for him to know that he wasn't alone. But what Franklin Vickers heard that night in the servants' quarters was not a normal prayer. Franklin was 58 years old and owned the estate where Gracie had worked for 7 years. He was a tall man, with grey hair and blue eyes that had once shone with faith, but now only reflected the emptiness of a man who had lost everything he loved. 5 years ago, his wife Eleanor had died of breast cancer. Franklin had prayed for her. He had promised God that if he saved her, he would donate half of his fortune to the church. He had lit candles. He had gone to Mass every Sunday. He had done everything a desperate man can do when the person he loves is dying. And Eleanor died anyway. 32 years of marriage. 2 children. A life built together. And God did nothing from that day on. Franklin declared himself an atheist. He wanted nothing to do with churches, or prayers, or faith. For him, it was all superstition, lies that people tell themselves to avoid facing the truth. We die alone, and no one saves us. But that night, as he walked towards his study past midnight, Franklin heard something that froze his blood. Whispers. They were coming from the servants' quarters. At first he thought Gracie was talking on the phone, but as he got closer, he recognized the words, "Hail Mary, full of grace." It was the prayer beads, the Rosary. Franklin felt a chill run down his spine. Not because he believed in ghosts, but because those words reminded him of everything he had lost. He moved closer. He put his hand on the door and opened it. What he saw inside changed everything. Gracie was kneeling on the cement floor. In her hands, the wooden prayer beads. And next to her, on a makeshift mattress, was an old man, very old, very sick. His eyes sunken, his skin yellowish, connected to a portable oxygen tank. The man opened his eyes when he heard the door and smiled. A smile that wasn't afraid. A smile that seemed to say, "I'm ready for whatever comes." Franklin stood paralyzed. He didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand why there was a dying man in the servants' quarters of his house. He didn't understand why Gracie was praying with him. But what Franklin heard in that room was not a normal conversation. It was something much deeper, something that was going to change his life. Forever. Gracie looked up. Her eyes were full of tears. But these weren't tears of fear. These were tears of shame. "Mr. Vickers, I can explain." Franklin said nothing. He just stared at the man on the mattress, at the prayer beads clutched in Gracie's hands, at the candle of the Virgin Mary, burning in the corner of the room, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. "Who is he?" Franklin asked, his voice trembling. Gracie swallowed hard. "He's my Uncle Arthur. He has pancreatic cancer. A terminal." Franklin closed his eyes. Cancer. That word he hated more than any other. The word that had stolen Elena from him. "Why? Is he here?" Franklin's voice was cold, but not with anger. It was the coldness of a man who has built walls around his heart to feel no more pain. Gracie lowered her gaze. "I don't have anyone else, sir. My uncle lives alone. He's very sick. I can't leave him alone all day. And I don't have money for a nurse." Franklin opened his eyes. He looked at Arthur. The old man returned his gaze, with those tired but serene eyes. And then Arthur spoke, in a raspy voice, weak, but full of dignity. "Don't be angry with my niece, sir. She just wants to make sure I don't die alone, like my brother died, like my wife died." Franklin felt something break inside him, something he had kept buried for 5 years. The memory of Elena, dying in that hospital bed. The memory of his own impotence. The memory of all the prayers that went unanswered. "How long has he been here?" Franklin asked. Gracie looked up. 2 weeks. Franklin nodded slowly. And how much time does he have left? Gracie closed her eyes. Tears began to fall. The doctors said 3 to 6 months, but that was a month ago. Franklin looked at the prayer beads in Gracie's hands, the worn beads, the years of faith, accumulated in that wood, polished by generations. And for the first time in 5 years, Franklin felt something he had forgotten. It wasn't faith and it wasn't hope. It was curiosity. Curiosity to understand how someone could continue praying after seeing so much death. How someone could believe it when the world showed them, time and time again, that prayers are useless. Gracie noticed his gaze. These prayer beads belonged to my mother, and before her, to my grandmother, and before her, to my great-grandmother. Franklin frowned. So what does that matter? Gracie held the prayer beads out in front of her. The beads gleamed in the candlelight, because each of them prayed for something impossible, and sometimes the impossible happened. Now Franklin felt a chill, not because he believed in miracles, but because he recognized something in Gracie's eyes. The same faith that Elena had, the same hope that he had lost. "Mr. Vickers." Arthur's voice broke the silence. Franklin looked at him. The old man was smiling. "Don't be angry with my niece. If you want to fire her, fire her. But don't blame her for believing. Believing is the only thing the poor have." Franklin said nothing. He just turned around and left the room. But he didn't go to call the police. He didn't go to wake the guards. He didn't go to fire Gracie. He went to his study. He sat in the armchair where Eleanor used to read. And for the first time in 5 years, Franklin wept. He wept for Elena. He wept for the prayers that never worked. He wept for the dying man in the servants' quarters. And he wept for something he couldn't explain. Something that felt like the beginning of something. Or maybe the end of something. That night, Franklin made a decision. He wasn't going to fire Gracie. He wasn't going to kick Arthur out. He was going to observe. He was going to see if Gracie's faith was real or just an illusion that would crumble when Arthur died. He was going to wait. And what he would discover in the next 8 months would change everything he thought he knew about life, death, and what lies in between. Because Arthur said something that night that made Gracie cry. Something that Franklin didn't hear because he had already left the room. Something that would change the course of this story forever. What Arthur told Gracie that night, after Franklin left, was something she would keep in her heart for the next 8 months. "Niece, don't cry for me. Cry for him." Gracie didn't understand. "For whom, uncle?" "For the man of the house. That man has a more broken heart than I do. And his cancer isn't of the body. It's of the soul." Gracie looked towards the door, where Franklin had disappeared, and for the first time, she understood something she hadn't noticed in 7 years of working for the Vickers family. Franklin Vickers was dying on the inside, not from cancer, from loneliness, from bitterness, from a lost faith that had turned into poison. That night, Gracie did something she had never done before. She added a name to her prayer journal. The journal was an old notebook with more than 200 pages, each page filled with names of people Gracie had prayed for over the years. Some had been healed, others had died, but Gracie never stopped praying. Because for her, prayer wasn't a transaction. It wasn't, "I pray, you give me." It was simply talking to someone who listened, even if sometimes the answer was silence. That night, Gracie wrote 2 new names, Arthur Henderson, and below, Franklin Vickers. The following days were strangely normal. Franklin didn't mention what he had seen. He didn't ask about Arthur. He didn't look at Gracie differently. It was as if nothing had happened. But Gracie knew that something had changed, because now, when she prayed in the servants' quarters with Arthur, she left the door ajar, not to hide, but so that Franklin could listen, if he wanted to. And Franklin listened. Every night. When he couldn't sleep, he walked down the hallway. He stopped in front of the servants' quarters and listened to Gracie's whispers, reciting the prayer beads. Hail Mary, full of grace. He didn't go in. He didn't say anything. He just listened. And every night, he felt something different. It wasn't faith. Not yet. It was something more primitive. It was the desire to believe. The desire for there to be something beyond death. Something beyond the emptiness he had felt since Elena left. Arthur was getting worse every week. Pancreatic cancer is cruel. It doesn't kill quickly. It kills slowly, stealing the appetite first, then the energy, then the color of the skin, and finally, the will to live. But Arthur didn't lose his will. Every day, when Gracie arrived with the breakfast, she prepared secretly in the vicar's kitchen. Arthur smiled. "Thank you, niece. Another day to bother people." And Gracie smiled too, even though, inside, she was dying of fear. Dr. Carol Reynolds called 3 weeks after the diagnosis. The news wasn't good. The tumor had grown. The metastases in his liver had multiplied. Uncle Arthur had at most 2 months left. Gracie received the call in the hallway of the estate. She listened to every word. She nodded, thanked the doctor, and hung up. Then she went to the bathroom, closed the door, and cried until she had no tears left. When she came out, Franklin was waiting for her. He was standing in front of the bathroom door with that expression that Gracie had learned to recognize. The expression of a man who had heard everything. "Bad news?" Franklin asked. Gracie nodded. She couldn't speak. Franklin looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that Gracie would never have expected. He took out his wallet, pulled out a credit card, and handed it to her. "Take him to a private clinic. Get him all the tests, the best doctors and the best treatments. Chemotherapy, radiation, whatever he needs." Gracie looked at the card. It was black, one of those cards that only millionaires have. "Mr. Vickers, I can't..." Franklin interrupted her. "It's not charity. It's a loan. You can pay me back when you can, even if it takes 100 years. Gracie looked up. There were tears in her eyes, but now they were different tears. "Why are you doing this?" Franklin didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the housekeeper's quarters, where Uncle Arthur was resting, where the candle to the Virgin of Guadalupe burned day and night. "Because 5 years ago, when my wife was dying, no one offered me help. And even if they had offered, it wouldn't have mattered. But maybe this time it'll be different." Gracie didn't understand completely, but she accepted the card. And that day, Arthur was transferred to the best private clinic in Dallas. Dr. Reynolds personally oversaw the case. Arthur started chemotherapy, experimental treatments, everything that modern medicine could offer. And every night, Gracie kept praying. Now not in the housekeeper's quarters, now in the hospital chapel, kneeling before the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, with her mother's prayer beads in her hands. Weeks passed. Arthur wasn't getting better, but he wasn't getting worse as quickly as the doctors had expected. It was as if something was holding him up, something that medicine couldn't explain. Franklin visited the hospital every Sunday, not to see Arthur, but to watch Gracie pray. He sat in the last pew of the chapel, watching as Gracie moved her lips silently, as her fingers ran over the beads of the prayer beads, as her face transformed when she prayed, from pain to peace, from fear to hope, from despair to something that seemed like acceptance. Franklin didn't understand. How could she accept that? Her uncle was dying. How could she have peace when death was so near? One Sunday, after Gracie finished praying, Franklin approached her. "Can I ask you something?" Gracie nodded. "Why do you keep praying? You know it probably won't work. The doctors say the cancer is too aggressive, that it's just a matter of time." Gracie looked at the prayer beads in her hands, the worn beads, the 50 years of accumulated prayers. "Mr. Vickers, when my mother was dying of diabetes, I prayed for her every day for 2 years. She wasn't cured. She died anyway." Franklin frowned. "Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because praying isn't about asking for miracles. It's about finding the strength to accept what comes. My mother died in peace, smiling, taking my hand. That was the miracle. Not the cure, the peace." Franklin felt something break inside him, something he had kept buried since Elena's death. A memory. Elena had also died in peace, smiling, taking his hand. But Franklin hadn't seen it as a miracle. He had seen it as a defeat, as proof that God didn't exist, or if he did exist, he didn't care. Gracie noticed the change in his expression. "Mr. Vickers, can I ask you something?" Franklin nodded. "Did you pray for your wife?" Franklin closed his eyes. The memory was too painful, too fresh, even though it had been 5 years. "Yes, I prayed. I promised God I would donate half my fortune if he saved her. I went to Mass every Sunday, I lit candles, I did everything. And what happened? She died anyway." Franklin opened his eyes, Miss. There were tears in them, tears he hadn't shed in 5 years. "She died anyway, and from that day, I knew everything was a lie. The prayers, the faith, God, everything." Gracie nodded slowly. "I understand." Franklin looked at her in surprise. "You understand? You're not going to tell me that God has a plan, that everything happens for a reason?" Gracie shook her head. "No, it's because I don't know if it's true. I don't know if God has a plan. I don't know why some people are cured and others aren't. I don't know anything." "Then why do you pray?" Gracie held up the prayer beads. "Because praying makes me feel like I'm not alone, that someone is listening, even if the answer is no, even if the answer is silence. At least I know someone is there." Franklin looked at the prayer beads, the worn beads, the years of accumulated faith. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt something he had forgotten. It wasn't faith, not yet, but it was something. It was the desire not to be alone. Franklin had a reason to hate prayers, and that reason had a name: Elena. But what Franklin didn't know was that Elena had left something for him, something he would find months later, something that would change everything. That night, Franklin couldn't sleep. He got up at 3 in the morning, went to the study, and for the first time in 5 years, opened the drawer where he kept Elena's things. There were photos, letters, a diary he had never dared to read, and at the bottom a sealed envelope, with his name written in Elena's handwriting. "Franklin, for when you are ready." Franklin looked at the envelope for an hour, and he didn't open it. He wasn't ready, but he knew that someday he would be. 2 months passed. Arthur was still alive, against all odds. The doctors didn't understand. The tumor had stopped growing. The metastases had stabilized. Gracie maintained a ritual every night. She arrived at the hospital at 7 in the evening. After finishing her day at the estate, she brought homemade food that she prepared in secret: vegetable soup, chicken and rice, the things that Arthur liked when he was a child, because Gracie remembered when she was 8 years old, and Arthur would take her in his taxi through the streets of Dallas. He would teach her the names of the neighborhoods. He would tell her stories of the strangest passengers. He used to buy her mango popsicles when it was hot. Uncle Arthur had been like a second father to Gracie. The father Gracie lost when she was 12 years old. Her father died in a work accident, a construction that collapsed. No one was held responsible. No one paid compensation. And Gracie and her mother were left alone. It was Uncle Arthur who helped them, who paid the rent for 6 months, who took Gracie to school when her mother had to work, who taught her that family isn't just blood. It's commitment. It's being present. It's not abandoning those you love when they need you most. That's why Gracie couldn't abandon Arthur now. That's why she prayed every night. That's why she believed. Because Arthur had believed in her when no one else did. When Gracie wanted to drop out of high school at 15 to work, Arthur refused. "You are going to finish high school, niece," he'd said. "I couldn't, but you can." And Gracie finished. She was the first in her family to graduate. Arthur was there at the ceremony, crying like a baby. Proud as only an uncle can be, those memories sustained her. In the darkest nights, when the doctors gave bad news, when Arthur's body seemed to give up, Gracie would close her eyes and remember. The mango popsicles, the taxi rides, the stories of crazy passengers, and she prayed, and not for a miracle, for time. Time to give Arthur back everything he had given her. It wasn't a cure, but it wasn't the quick death everyone expected either. Arthur joked with the nurses, told them stories of his years as a cab driver, made them laugh with his bad jokes. And every night, when Gracie came to pray the prayer beads, Arthur joined her, his voice weak, his hands trembling as he held the beads, but his eyes filled with something that seemed like peace. Dr. Carol Reynolds didn't know how to explain it. Medically, Arthur should be dead, or at least much worse. But there he was, smiling, telling jokes, praying, living. 5 months after the diagnosis, Dr. Reynolds called with news that no one expected. Gracie was cleaning the floors of the estate when her phone rang. It was the doctor. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to come to the hospital," Dr. Reynolds said. "We have the results of the latest CAT scan." Gracie felt like the world stopped. "Is it bad news?" she asked. The doctor paused. "I don't know," she said. "Honestly, I don't know what it is." Gracie arrived at the hospital in less than an hour. Franklin accompanied her, not because she had asked him to, but because he wanted to know. He wanted to understand. He wanted to see if Gracie's faith was real or just an illusion. Dr. Reynolds received them in her office. She had the CAT scan on the screen, and her expression was something Gracie had never seen. It wasn't the expression of bad news, nor was it the expression of good news. It was the expression of someone who doesn't understand what they are seeing. "Look at this," Dr. Reynolds said, pointing to the screen. "This is the CAT scan from 5 months ago," she explained. "You can see the tumor here, the metastases here, here, and here." Gracie nodded. She remembered it. The image that had robbed her of sleep for months. "And this is today's CAT scan." The doctor changed the image. Gracie looked and didn't understand what she was seeing. "Where's the tumor?" Franklin asked. The doctor looked at him. "That's the question," she replied. Franklin frowned. "I don't understand," he said. The doctor sighed. "The tumor has shrunk by 70%, she stated. "The metastases have almost completely disappeared. I can't explain it. It doesn't make medical sense. Arthur shouldn't be getting better. He should be dead." Gracie felt her legs give way. She had to sit down. "Are you saying that my uncle?" she started. The doctor raised her hand. "I'm not saying he's cured," Dr. Reynolds clarified. "There's still cancer, but it's in partial remission. Something I've never seen in stage 4 pancreatic cancer." Franklin looked at the screen, the empty space where there had once been a tumor, the clear areas where there had once been metastases, and he felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Fear. Fear of believing. Fear of having hope. Fear that it was all an illusion that would crumble. "What caused it?" Franklin inquired. The doctor shook her head. "I don't know," she confessed. "The chemotherapy helped, but this goes beyond what chemotherapy can do. Sometimes it happens. Spontaneous remissions. They're extremely rare, less than 1% of cases, but they happen." Gracie looked at Franklin, and Franklin looked at Gracie. And at that moment, They both thought the same thing, but neither said it out loud. 3 more months passed. Arthur continued to improve. He no longer needed oxygen. He had regained his appetite. The color had returned to his skin. And every night, he continued to pray the prayer beads with Gracie. Dr. Reynolds ordered tests every 2 weeks. Each time the results were better. The tumor was shrinking. The metastases were disappearing, and no one could explain why. Arthur asked Franklin for something that changed everything. It was a Sunday night. Franklin had gone to the hospital for his weekly visit. Arthur was sitting in bed, eating green gelatin, smiling as always. "Mr. Vickers, sit down," he offered. Franklin sat down. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Arthur shrugged. "Better than ever," he replied. "The doctors say I'm a miracle. I say I'm a stubborn old man who doesn't want to die yet." Franklin half smiled. Arthur looked at him intently. "Mr. Vickers, can I ask you a favor?" he asked. Franklin nodded. "Read the letter," Arthur urged. Franklin frowned. "What letter?" he questioned. "The one your wife left you," Arthur revealed. "The one you've kept in that drawer for 5 years." Franklin felt a chill. "How do you know about that letter?" he asked, surprised. Arthur smiled. "Gracie told me that you lost your wife to cancer," he explained. "And when you lose someone like that, you always leave things unsaid, things unread and things undone. I bet you anything your wife left you something. A letter, a message, something." Franklin didn't say anything. He just stared at the old man. At the man who should be dead. At the man who somehow continued to live. "Mr. Vickers, don't wait until you're dying to read that letter," Arthur pleaded. "I almost died without telling my niece how much I love her. Don't make the same mistake." Franklin nodded slowly, and that night when he returned home, he went to the study. He opened the drawer. And finally, after 5 years, he opened the envelope. Elena's letter was written on that blue paper she always used. The same paper where she wrote the shopping lists, where she wrote down doctor's appointments, where she left small messages of love hidden in Franklin's pockets. Franklin unfolded the paper with trembling hands, and he read, "My love, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And it also means you're finally ready to move on. I don't know how much time has passed, knowing you probably years. You're the most stubborn man I know, but also the most loyal. Franklin, I have to confess something. I knew I was going to die. I knew it from the first diagnosis. The doctors told me the cancer was too aggressive, that the odds were almost 0. But I never told you because I didn't want to take away your hope. And you prayed for me. I know, I heard you every night when you thought I was asleep. I saw you light candles at church when you thought no one was watching. And even though I knew it wouldn't work, I never asked you to stop. Because those prayers weren't for me. They were for you. Praying gave you peace. It gave you something to hold on to. It gave you hope in the darkest days. And that, my love, was the real miracle, not my healing. Your peace. Franklin, I know that when I die, you're going to be angry with God. It's natural. It's human. I was angry at first, too. But over time, I understood something. Faith isn't believing that God will give us everything we ask for. Faith is believing that no matter what happens, we're not alone. I wasn't alone, Franklin. I had you, and that was enough. So when you're ready, I want you to do something for me. Don't stop believing. Don't stop praying. Don't stop having hope. Not for me, for you. Because hope is the only thing that keeps us alive when everything else crumbles. I love you, Franklin. I always loved you. And I always will love you. Even when I'm gone. Yours always, Eleanor. Franklin read the letter 3 times. Each time the tears fell harder. Each time he felt something inside him break, but also rebuild. Eleanor had known all along. She had known she was going to die, and instead of telling him the truth, she had let him have hope. She had let him pray. She had let him believe. Because faith wasn't about the outcome, it was about the process. It was about finding peace in the midst of chaos. Franklin folded the letter. He put it in his pocket. And for the first time in 5 years, he did something he had sworn he would never do again. He knelt down. He closed his eyes. And he prayed. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't beg for miracles. He just spoke with Eleanor, with God, with whoever was listening. Thank you. Thank you for Eleanor. Thank you for the 32 years we had. Thank you for letting her go in peace. And forgive me. Forgive me for being angry for so long. Franklin didn't know how long he knelt there. When he opened his eyes, it was already dawn, and he felt different, not cured, not completely healed, but different, like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. That morning, Franklin went to church for the first time in 5 years. Not for mass, just to sit, to be, to remember what it felt like to believe. And when Gracie arrived at work that morning, Franklin was waiting for her at the door. With his mother's prayer beads in his hand, "Eleanor left me a letter," Franklin said. Gracie nodded. "She told me that faith isn't about asking for miracles. It's about not feeling alone." Gracie smiled softly. "That's exactly what it is." Franklin gave her back the prayer beads. "Thank you for reminding me." Gracie took the prayer beads, the worn beads, the 50 years of prayers. "Mr. Vickers, tonight I'm going to pray for your wife. Would you like to join me?" Franklin nodded. "Yes, I think I would." 8 months. 8 months had passed since Uncle Arthur's terminal diagnosis. 8 months of chemotherapy, of experimental treatments, of hospital visits, and 8 months of prayers. Every night Gracie prayed the prayer beads, sometimes alone, sometimes with Uncle Arthur, and now sometimes with Franklin, the atheist millionaire who had lost his faith when he lost his wife. The man who hated prayers because they hadn't saved Eleanor. Now he prayed, and not because he believed it would change anything, but because it gave him peace, because it made him feel like he wasn't alone, because every Hail Mary reminded him of Eleanor. Dr. Carol Reynolds called on a Tuesday morning, 8 months exactly after the diagnosis. Her voice was different. It wasn't the professional voice Gracie had heard so many times. It was the voice of someone who couldn't believe what she was about to say. "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to come to the hospital. The results of the latest scan came in." Gracie felt her heart race. "Is it good news?" The doctor paused for a long time. Too long. "Mrs. Henderson, in 20 years of my career, I have never seen anything like this." Gracie arrived at the hospital running. Franklin drove her in his car. Uncle Arthur was already in Dr. Reynolds' office, sitting in a wheelchair, smiling as always. "Niece, you're here." The doctor looks like she's seen a ghost. Dr. Reynolds was standing in front of the screen, where there should have been a scan showing cancer. But what the screen showed was something completely different. "Look at this." The doctor pointed to the image. "This is the scan from 8 months ago. 6-centimeter tumor in the pancreas. Metastasis in the liver, lungs, and lymph nodes." Gracie remembered. The image that had kept her up at night. The death sentence. And this is today's scan. The doctor changed the image, and Gracie saw nothing, literally. There was no tumor. There was no metastasis. There was nothing. "Where's the cancer?" Franklin asked. The doctor looked at him. The exam showed something that medicine couldn't explain. "There's no cancer." Dr. Reynolds spoke slowly, as if she herself didn't believe what she was saying. "Complete remission. No evidence of disease. The tumor disappeared. The metastases disappeared. Everything disappeared." Gracie collapsed into a chair. Tears began to fall. "How?" The doctor shook her head. I don't know. The chemotherapy helped, but this isn't just chemotherapy. Complete spontaneous remissions in stage 4 pancreatic cancer are almost impossible. Less than 1%. I've seen one case in 20 years, and that patient was 50 years old, not 64. Uncle Arthur smiled from his wheelchair. Doctor, I can explain it to you. My niece prayed for me. Every day for 8 months. Every night the complete prayer beads. That's more than 14,000 Hail Marys. Dr. Reynolds sighed. Mr. Henderson, as a doctor, I can't attribute this to prayer. There's no scientific evidence that... Uncle Arthur interrupted her. Doctor, I'm not saying it was a miracle either. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was the chemotherapy. Maybe my body just decided it wasn't ready to give up the ghost. I honestly couldn't tell you. But what I do know is that for 8 long months, I wasn't alone. My niece Gracie, she prayed for me. Franklin Vickers footed the bill for my treatment. The nurses, they took great care of me. And you, doctor, you did everything you could. And that's the closest thing to a miracle I've ever seen in my life. Dr. Carol Reynolds didn't say a word. She just looked at the old man, at the man who should have been dead, at the man who somehow, against all medical logic, was still alive and kicking. Mr. Henderson, we're going to keep a close eye on you. Checkups every 3 months. If the cancer comes back, it's not coming back, Uncle Arthur said with a smile as wide as the Texas sky. The doctor frowned, a crease forming between her eyebrows. How can you be so sure? Arthur just shrugged nonchalantly. I don't know, but after everything that's happened, I decided something. I'm going to live every day like it's my last, and I'm going to be thankful every morning I wake up. Because 8 months ago, the doctors told me I wouldn't even make it to Christmas. And here I am, eating lime jello, making the nurses laugh, and thinking about all the things I still want to do. Franklin looked at Arthur, a long, searching gaze. Then he glanced at Gracie. And then he stared at the monitor screen. The image was clear. No cancer, no impending death, no sentence hanging over them all like a dark cloud for the past 8 months. Franklin finally understood what his wife had been trying to tell him. Faith wasn't about demanding miracles. It was about finding peace. It was about not feeling alone. It was about being thankful for what you have while you still have it. Eleanor hadn't been cured, but she had died peacefully, smiling, holding his hand tight. And that, Franklin now understood, had been the real miracle, not the curing, the peace, the acceptance, the love that remains even when everything else is gone. Arthur left the hospital that afternoon, walking tall. No wheelchair, no oxygen tank, nothing but Gracie's prayer beads tucked safely in his pocket. Before stepping out the main doors, Arthur paused. He looked back, at the building where he'd spent 8 months, where he'd endured chemotherapy that made him violently ill, where he'd lost his hair, where he'd cried in silence when he thought no one was watching, and where he'd found something he never expected: hope. Arthur remembered his first night in the clinic, when the pain was so intense he couldn't sleep a wink, when he looked out the window and considered giving up, quitting the fight, accepting that his time had come and gone. But then he heard something. Whispers. They were coming from down the hall. It was Gracie, kneeling in the hospital chapel, saying her prayer beads at 3 in the morning. Arthur had gotten up with great effort. He shuffled down to the chapel and sat beside her. What are you doing here, sweetheart? It's awfully late. Gracie didn't open her eyes, her voice soft and steady. Praying, Uncle. I just can't sleep. Arthur smiled, a warm, genuine smile. Me neither. This pain won't let me. Gracie opened her eyes, meeting his weary gaze. Want to join me? Arthur nodded slowly. And that night, for the first time in years, Arthur prayed. Not because he believed it would actually work, but because he didn't want Gracie praying alone. That became their nightly routine. Every night, at 3 in the morning, Arthur would get up and go to the chapel and pray with Gracie. The nurses would find them there every morning, asleep on the chapel benches, the prayer beads clutched between their intertwined hands. Dr. Reynolds never knew about those late-night encounters, but the nurses did, and they spoke of them in hushed tones, of the old man with terminal cancer who got up every night to pray, of the niece who never left his side, of the love that seemed stronger than the disease itself. Now, standing in the doorway of the hospital, Arthur remembered everything, and he smiled. Because he had survived, not just the cancer, but the loneliness, the despair, the overwhelming urge to give up. "Thank you," Arthur whispered, gazing up at the sky. He didn't know who he was talking to God, to his deceased wife, to life itself. But he felt that someone was listening, and that was enough. Dr. Reynolds watched him leave from her office window, and for the first time in her 20-year career, she didn't know how to write the medical report. Complete spontaneous remission, cause unknown. That was all she could say, because medicine has no words for the unexplainable, and what had happened to Arthur was exactly that, unexplainable. That night at the Vickers family estate in Dallas, there was a celebratory dinner. Franklin prepared everything personally. He invited Arthur, Gracie, Dr. Reynolds, who accepted after much deliberation, and the neighbors who had never understood why the reclusive millionaire seemed so sad. It was the first dinner Franklin had hosted since Elena's death, the first time the estate had echoed with laughter, the first time Franklin had smiled a genuine smile. Arthur told stories from his years as a taxi driver. Gracie served the meal she had cooked herself, a feast of Southern comfort. Dr. Reynolds listened in silence, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. And Franklin finally seemed at peace. At the end of the dinner, Arthur stood up, clearing his throat. "I want to propose a toast." Everyone looked at him expectantly. 8 months ago, the doctors told me I wouldn't see another Christmas, and the truth is I didn't believe it either. But here I am, eating the best dinner of my life, surrounded by people who care about a stubborn old codger like me. Arthur raised his glass high. "But I'm not going to toast to myself. I'm going to toast to my niece, Gracie. Because she never stopped believing. She never stopped praying. She never stopped having hope, even when all the doctors said there was nothing more to be done." Arthur turned to Gracie, his eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Sweetheart, I don't know if it was your prayer beads that saved me. I don't know if it was the medicine, I don't know if it was just plain dumb luck, but what I do know is that every night, when I heard you praying, I felt like I wasn't alone, and that gave me the strength to keep fighting." Gracie's eyes welled up with tears. "Uncle," Arthur smiled. "Cheers to faith, to hope, to the miracles we can't explain, and to the people who never stop believing." Everyone raised their glasses and clinked them together, and that night, for the first time in a long time, no one at that table felt alone. A year later, Arthur was still alive and well. The quarterly checkups showed the same thing every time. No evidence of disease, complete remission. The cancer had not returned. Dr. Reynolds stopped trying to explain it. She just monitored, observed, and gave silent thanks for what she had witnessed. Arthur had gone back to driving a taxi, not because he needed the money. Franklin had offered him money, lots of it, an apartment, anything he wanted. But Arthur wanted to work. He wanted to feel useful. He wanted to keep telling stories to the passengers who hopped into his cab. And every night when his shift ended, he'd go to the Vickers family estate to have dinner with Gracie and Franklin. They had become an unusual family. The millionaire who lost his faith and then regained it, the housekeeper who never stopped believing, and the old guy who should have been dead but kept telling bad jokes. Gracie continued working at the estate, but now it was different. She wasn't just the housekeeper anymore. She was part of the family. Franklin had insisted that she stop cleaning floors and supervise the other employees, but Gracie refused. "Mr. Vickers, cleaning gives me peace. It's my way of praying. Each swipe of the rag is a prayer." Franklin learned not to argue. Gracie's prayer journal now had over 300 pages. Each day, she wrote down new intentions, new names, new requests. Not all of them were granted. Some people died, others remained sick. But Gracie never stopped praying. Because for her, prayer wasn't a transaction, it was a conversation. And sometimes, the answer was no, but at least there was an answer. Franklin started going to Mass on Sundays again, not to the big church downtown, but to a small chapel on the outskirts of Dallas, where no one knew him, where he could sit in the last pew and simply be. Sometimes he prayed. Sometimes he just listened. Sometimes he thought about Eleanor, and always, he felt peace. He had donated half of his fortune to cancer hospitals, not because he felt obligated, not because he wanted to buy something, but because Eleanor had taught him that money is useless if it isn't shared. The promise he had made years ago, when Eleanor was sick, he finally fulfilled, not because he expected a miracle in return, but because it was the right thing to do, because Eleanor would have wanted it that way. The candle to the Virgin Mary that Gracie had lit 8 months ago finally went out. It had lasted exactly until the day that Arthur received his clean bill of health. Gracie kept it. She didn't throw it away. She put it in a box next to her mother's prayer beads and the prayer journal, relics of faith, proof that sometimes, about when you least expect it, life surprises you. 2 years after the terminal diagnosis, Arthur celebrated his 66th birthday. The party was at the vicar's estate. Taxi drivers who had worked with him decades ago came. Nurses from the hospital who had cared for him. Dr. Reynolds, who no longer tried to explain anything. And Gracie, who made the cake with her own hands. Arthur blew out the candles. 66. 2 years more than the doctors had promised him. When they asked him what he had wished for, he smiled. Nothing. I already have everything I wanted. Time, family, and a second chance I didn't deserve. Gracie hugged him. Of course you deserved it, Uncle Arthur. Arthur shook his head. No, Gracie, no one deserves second chances. But sometimes we get them anyway. And the only thing we can do is be grateful. Franklin listened in silence and thought about Eleanor, about the letter she had left him, about the words he had finally understood. Faith isn't believing that God is going to give us everything we ask for. Faith is believing that no matter what happens, we are not alone. Franklin wasn't alone anymore. He had Gracie. He had Arthur. He had memories of Eleanor. That didn't hurt so much anymore. And he had a peace that he had thought was lost forever. This story doesn't end with a perfect happy ending, because life isn't perfect. Arthur continues to get checkups every 3 months. The cancer can come back at any time. Dr. Reynolds has told him that many times. But Arthur isn't afraid. Mr. Vickers, Arthur said one night, while they were watching the sunset from the balcony of the estate. Yes, if the cancer comes back, I don't want you to feel bad. I don't want you to think that the prayers didn't work. Franklin looked at him. Why are you telling me this? Arthur smiled. Because I know people like you. People who lost their faith and regained it. You're the most fragile, and if something goes wrong, you lose it again. Franklin didn't say anything. He just listened. Mr. Vickers, faith isn't about results. It's not about whether I get cured or not. It's about what we do while we wait for the result. And during these 2 years, you did something you hadn't done in a long time. What? You lived. Franklin closed his eyes and knew that Arthur was right. For 5 years after Eleanor's death, Franklin hadn't lived. He had only existed, waiting for death, hating God, growing bitter a little more each day. But now, it was different. Now he had dinners with Gracie and Arthur. He had Sundays at the chapel. He had letters from Eleanor that he reread whenever he needed to remember. He had life, and that, he understood now, was the true miracle. Not Arthur's healing, not the inexplicable remission, not the tumor that disappeared. The true miracle was coming back to life after having died inside. Gracie finished cleaning the last floor of the estate. It was late. The full moon shone over Dallas, and in the service room, where it had all begun, Gracie knelt one last time. She took out her mother's prayer beads, the beads worn smooth by generations of women who had believed and prayed. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't beg for miracles. She just gave thanks. Thank you for my uncle. Thank you for Mr. Vickers. Thank you for each day you give me. And if tomorrow everything changes, if the cancer comes back, if something bad happens, thank you anyway. Because today, in this moment, I have everything I need. Faith, family, hope. Gracie finished the prayer. She stood up, and before turning off the light, she looked at the photo of her mother that she had on the nightstand. A smiling woman, with the same prayer beads in her hands. I did it, Mum. I still believe. The story of Grace Henderson didn't appear in the newspapers. It wasn't a television news story. It didn't go viral on social media. It was simply one more story of the thousands that happen every day. A housekeeper who prayed for her sick uncle. A millionaire who regained his faith after losing his wife. An old man who defied medical statistics of nothing extraordinary, nothing miraculous, just life. But there's something I want you to remember from this story. It's not about Arthur's healing. It's not about the inexplicable remission. It's not about whether miracles exist or not. It's about Gracie, a woman who never stopped believing, who prayed for 8 months without knowing if it would do any good, who found peace in the midst of chaos. What she taught a bitter millionaire was that faith isn't about asking for things. It's about feeling like you're not alone. That's the lesson. Faith doesn't cure cancer. Doctors cure cancer. Medicine cures cancer, sometimes, and even they can't. But faith gives you strength to face whatever comes. It gives you peace in the darkest moments. It gives you hope when everything seems lost. And sometimes, just sometimes, life surprises you. Not as proof that God exists, not as a reward for believing, but as a reminder that there are always mysteries we can't explain, and that hope should never die. Because as long as there's someone praying for you, as long as there's someone who cares, as long as there's someone who won't give up, you're not alone, and that at the end of the day is the only thing that matters. Uncle Arthur is still alive as I tell this story. He's 68 years old. He still drives a taxi. He still tells bad jokes. And he still says his prayer beads with Gracie every night. Franklin Vickers is 62 years old. He still goes to church on Sundays. He still donates money to cancer hospitals. And he still rereads Elena's letter when he needs to remember. Gracie Henderson is 50 years old. She still cleans floors. She still writes names in her prayer journal. And she still believes, because for her, faith was never about miracles. It was about finding light in the darkness. It was about moving forward when everything seems lost. It was about remembering that there is always, always hope. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs it. And if you're going through something difficult, remember Elena's words. Faith isn't believing that God will give us everything we ask for. Faith is believing that no matter what happens, we're not alone. You are not alone. You never have been. And if you close your eyes and listen carefully, maybe you can hear the same thing that Franklin Vickers heard that night in the maid's quarters: whispers, prayers, and the sound of someone who believes, someone who never stops believing, someone like Gracie, someone like you. This story has come to an end, but Gracie's faith lives on. In every prayer beads she says, in every name she writes in her journal, in every person she decides to keep believing in, when the world tells them there's no reason to. Thank you for listening. And remember, hope should never die. Never.